Every year around late November, the sensation of fall weather usually triggers an urge to start a new save file in Ocarina of Time if I'm not already doing so. Because I'm always wanting to relive the thrill that only this game's opening section can provide. No matter what year it is, what I've got going on in life, I always end up back in Kokiri Forest to make the trek through Hyrule all over again. It's a game that's sold over 150 million copies worldwide and remains at the very top of the list for best games of all time. It truly hasn't been beaten, bested, or topped by any other Zelda game. Some think it hasn't been topped by any game. OOT is not merely a hit nor a staple, it transcends that. It's endured as a cultural touchstone and perennial classic, not to mention a Zelda fan favorite, and is held in the highest regard by games publications, journalists, gamers, and critics alike. Forget a second life, forget a resurgence, this game was so consequential, it actually never went away. And is one of the many millions who've since played and fallen in love with it. It's been surreal witnessing a video game that I adore keep inspiring people year after year. And yes, there are a ton of YouTube videos and retrospectives that have already done this. One thing I know about OOT fans is they never get tired of hearing strangers talk about their favorite video game. So without further ado, I'm Oklasoft, and this is my retrospective on The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I like any adventure that's tight, fun, and compact, and Zelda 1 was my first, but the game was too cryptic for a 5-year-old, and although the gold cart was sweet, the game went over my head back then, and I didn't figure out how to get the sword in the first cave of the first screen until years later, and by that time I'd moved on. n.e.s. Zelda really just frustrated 6-year-old me, so it sat on the shelf in favor of simpler n.e.s. games. I was an n.e.s. addict as a kid, and Mario 3 was mine and everyone else's favorite, but platformers were mostly what I wanted to play, and I knew that Zelda was a different kind of game. This is before I knew what an action RPG even was. Zelda in the NES faded out of my life and into obscurity as the legendary system took bottom billing in my console stash. I even felt a little guilt, and by the mid-90s I would take my neglected NES out every now and then, dust it off and hook it up. Mario 3 would usually be in the cartridge slot, and then I'd proceed to get the warp whistles and warp to World 7, then immediately to World 8, then realize I wasn't up for the challenge and turn it off. But my conscience was just nagging me to respect my elder NES. After all, it is the godfather of console gaming. The reverence and respect it receives to this day is truly deserved, if not a little predictable. NES games on the whole are just gimmicky and short, and they harken back to a simpler time in game development. I know there are amazing titles all over the system, and I loved my NES, but once I put it down I never really picked it back up. That's still mostly the case today. If I'm looking for an old school 2D system nowadays, I aim squarely for the Super Nintendo.
A bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
I cherish the Super NES. It was the one that got away in the Nintendo console that made me envious like nothing else could for a Genesis owner in '94. This was the height of the 16-bit console war. This was the height of Super Nintendo versus Sega on the school bus. And 2 to 3 years later, after doing a 180 and going all in for the N around '97, I had every Nintendo system but the SNES. Okay, I also didn't have the Virtual Boy, but I didn't want one. Like I said, the NES did mean a lot to me as a kid, so after dipping my toes in with the Play It Loud Game Boy and doing a backflip off the diving board with the N64, I set my sights on the other great Nintendo system. You see, I'd struck out with friends and family repeatedly. Even some of my own relatives refused to let me borrow their SNES, and one of the most coveted games for me was... what else? Link to the Past had my attention. It was a drastic improvement over Zelda 1, and if for no other reason than the bidirectional sword swipe, which thankfully now gives Link some semblance of defense and actual precision aim with his sword. Zelda 1's mechanics end up feeling more like a chore than anything, however, and the subtle upgraded moveset and deeper mechanical depth of LTTP combined with the lush 16-bit pixel art depiction of Hyrule, and I knew this game kicked ass. I always got to play the opening section at other people's houses, so I knew how hard Nintendo had upped the ante on this one. In addition to the graphical upgrades, the game's music and story benefited from the increased storage capacity of the SNES. Link to the Past features some seriously bombastic orchestral arrangements and what has to be some of my favorite early work from renowned composer and living legend Koji Kondo. Link to the Past soundtrack really took the game up a notch, and the final product is a statement from Nintendo. Luckily for us, Koji Kondo would stick around for a few more projects, and come to think of it, Koji Kondo also made the music for Mario Bros. 3 and Star Fox 64 and... oh, I see. So I was cold on Zelda 1, but Link to the Past was my shit. I just didn't own it and I couldn't play it yet. Even then, I loved that video games were such an evolving medium. I shudder at the thought of being born in an alternate timeline where video games never existed or haven't been invented yet. It always amazes me that I've been lucky enough to be a kid in the age of Nintendo and their Japanese products sweeping through my home country. So yeah, I was lucky, and I was even luckier to own a Game Gear, an NES, and a Genesis all at once. But what I really loved were 2D platformers: Sonic, Mario, Earthworm Jim, Vector Man, Contra, DKC, whatever. I love platformers. Mario was fascinating because of how the levels connected to each other, and the addition of a playable, traversable world map in Mario 3 kicked it into overdrive. I would daydream about new levels that didn't exist. And I had a comic book where Mario hangs out underwater in a series of pipes with Bertha the fish. And my cousin's house where I was visiting had a bunch of saltwater fish tanks. I always remember that weird Mario comic book and the awesome underwater artwork and just the way it depicted the pipes. It's something like fundamental and mechanical in my brain, but machines just speak to me, and I'll bet they speak to the Mario devs too. That comic book just made me want to play Mario 3 more. The diversity of biomes and network of pipes, tunnels, warps, and worlds, along with the colorful characters and fascinating art style. The way the Mushroom Kingdom is depicted in Mario 3 remains iconic. It has cult status on the Mount Rushmore of gaming, as it should. Zelda 1 may have been top-down and different from the 2D side-scrolling action platformers I was used to, but I could tell the new perspective was in service of the game's slower, more methodical premise of discovery and exploration rather than the Mario and Sonic gameplay loop of going as fast as possible while avoiding and stopping enemies to reach the end of the stage. Skilled players will memorize the enemies and layout and then proceed to fly through the level. Mario and Sonic are kinetic experiences where fluid motion and approachable physics are key to both games, even if they feel radically different to play. RPG was a brand new acronym for me, something I'd been reading about in EGM magazine. Lots of D&D adjacent gamers, or the kind of guys who would write letters to the editor, were super into this stuff. I was getting my first glimpse of a fandom. RPGs as a genre were new and mysterious to me. It's something that the older kids did. They also had a dorky reputation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But figuring out why, RPGs appeared to be menu-driven, stat-driven, and generally were lacking most of the interesting physics that made platformers tick, but they traded that for a depth of inhabitants and locales to explore. On the whole, 8 and 16-bit systems are defined by a slew of attempts, and some successful and some not, at translating a real-life or fantastical scenario into a playable experience. So the SNES was essentially an iteration on the NES that did the same basic games, just better. Final Fantasy VI was the culmination of all this, a technical marvel for its time. FF6, or 3 as it was called in the West, shows what can be done in 16 bits when the dev teams pull out all the stops and refuse to allow the medium to limit artistic expression. RPG fans yearn for the feeling one gets whilst embarking on a grand adventure, or the sensation of heading out to explore the unknown. Seeing their character grow during a playthrough is super satisfying, as is pulling up an old save file that's been maxed out and just admiring your inventory screen. Fun fact, during this playthrough of OOT, I managed to permanently lose the Zora tunic after getting it swallowed by a like in Ganon's tower. RPGs are the anti-platformer, trading in slick, speedy motion for a bag full of equipment and items. Zelda 3 on the NES may not be a traditional JRPG like Chrono Trigger, but the element of character growth, new items, and upgrades I think are what classify it partly as an RPG. It's the questing, the embarking, the journey that nerds crave. The proposition of finding new items along the way that makes it rewarding, and the give and take between Link's growing arsenal and the game's rising difficulty. Even though I had a decent N64 library, by summer of '97 I was still playing Mario 64 more than anything. I loved booting up the game and running around the castle courtyard, going down the sewer drain at the bottom of the moat, and ending up back at the waterfall or cave area with the green metal Mario switch. After 120 starring my original save file, I would have the same routine: boot the game up, get 99 lives from Yoshi on the roof, then head to Lethal Lava Land or Shifting Sand Land, and skate around on a Koopa shell like it was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I did own the real Tony Hawk at some point after first trying the demo on PC in '99, but before that gem even came out, Mario 64 was allowing that type of experience, that freeform, non-tank control movement that felt oh so natural with the analog stick. So basically, Mario 64 contains other genres of game within itself, which was very cool to me at 13. The overall complexity and expressiveness of Mario 64's moveset was such a leap from its 16 and 8-bit forebears that it was probably the first game that I truly fell in love with for its mechanics as well as the game in general. Mario 3's depth was all coming from the X and Y axis. Miyamoto and his uber-talented team of programmers gave Mario complex, variable speed and realistic momentum. The subtle transfer of motion as Mario accelerates to a sprint, jumps, hops around, and lands with precision on platforms is just so good, and it always has been. Mario may appear simplistic, but great care was taken in the way Mario feels to move around. It's all about feel, and you know Nintendo dialed that shit in perfectly. I knew instinctively that once the N64 came out, once 3D games were the standard, games would get exponentially cooler. There's simply no substitute for being able to represent the third dimension inside our computer software, as hard as we tried. I love the Super NES, but there's a reason why my heart always lands on the N64. Maybe it was my age, but however it coincided, by July that year, I was finally bored of Mario 64. Now I was looking for a worthy successor. Everyone knew the next Zelda game, for N64 and 3D, would eventually be out, but we still had a year to go. I was just looking for something, anything that would fill the void for a little while. Since Mario Kart was also an excellent early release, I took a chance on Diddy Kong Racing, and was rewarded handsomely for it. I actually loved Diddy Kong Racing. I beat all the challenges, stomped on WizPig, and the fact that it was a racing game was sort of tangential, really. I loved DKR for the adventure mode and the unlockables. I just loved the idea of a little interlocking stages and areas on an island that open up bit by bit as you perform different challenges. It's just satisfying. DKR had filled the gap nicely in between Mario 64 and Summer 98. But one humid night, my mom took me to Toys R Us in Northwest Houston like we usually did, and with my birthday money, I bought Banjo-Kazooie. I remember really hoping that Banjo would be another Mario 64, which is what I wanted after all, and the game didn't disappoint. I didn't care for the Banjo-Kazooie's character aesthetics at first, the witch, the monsters, and the Halloween-y vibe. It was all kind of cheesy to me then, and still is, but despite me not being stoked on the character models, I took a chance and it ended up being the funnest, meatiest adventure on the N64. It was something new that wasn't Mario, and I could sink my teeth into it for a few months until the new Zelda game came out. And for that, I've always appreciated it. School was back in session fall 98, and Banjo-Kazooie had served its purpose as a fun pre-Ocarina adventure. And I never picked up 2E on the 64 when it was current, but I will eventually. Most of the N64 games that I played and cared about were by Rare and Nintendo, so it made sense that DKR fucking ruled. Diddy Kong Racing was a sleeper hit and a surprise banger. It also happened to be Banjo's first official game. I completed Banjo, but my cousin deleted my save file when he came over to my house for Thanksgiving that year. I let him play my N64 for a little while, and the next time I booted my game up, my entire save file was deleted. I always remembered that dick move that my cuz pulled, but it was all good for me because life was good. One night during the same Thanksgiving break, and my best bud Chad was spending the night. We ended up going to Blockbuster, and somehow we were able to rent a gray cartridge copy of Ocarina of Time. I don't remember if it was hard to get, but whatever the case, we had it, and we were now actually playing Ocarina of Time for the very first time. Even though my gold collector's copy was still sitting in a Toys R Us warehouse. The game begins with Link dreaming of Hyrule Castle Town during a rainstorm. The town's drawbridge lowers and a horse carrying a girl and a woman gallop past him. The girl looks at Link, who stands outside of the town walls as the horse gallops out of sight, and a buff, foreboding, wicked-looking man raises his arm toward Link, and then we awaken. The Deku tree says, "Navi, Navi, where art thou? Come hither. Dost thou sense it? The climate of evil descending upon this realm. Malevolent forces even now are mustering to attack our land of Hyrule." We then see the opening cutscene with Navi flying around the forest, panning and swooping around the different children and huts. There's an undeniable feeling of enchantment when this game starts up, with heavy inspiration taken from Peter Pan clearly, and after the brief exchange between Navi and us, we're up and climbing down the ladder for the very first time. So we're off to gather rupees, get our sword and shield, and then make our way to the Deku tree's mouth. I know Nintendo is building up the happy carefree vibe now because it's not gonna last. We enter the Deku tree, begin tackling the first dungeon of the game. The score thus far is enchanting, energetic, and beautiful. In truth, Kokiri Forest and the Deku tree are nothing but one giant tutorial area, expertly disguised as the first dungeon, and by the time you get your slingshot, learn how to harness fire, use the Deku sticks, learn how the controls and the weapon assignments all work, and crucially get the hang of Z targeting, which I always put on switch mode, you're smacking around Queen Goma like it's nothing, and you're running out of the Deku tree as soon as you came. The game thus far has done a great job of making you feel in control of Link and his growing arsenal, sticks, nuts, and seeds, but this is only the beginning. Deku sticks are shown to light torches and function as a temporary sword, and the way every item in the game is assignable to a different button or slot was pretty brilliantly executed. Even if you're playing the original, 3DS gameplay on PC requires a good mouse and a decent way of accessing it repeatedly, so it can get a tad unwieldy, but once you do, it's smooth sailing with the bonus of barely any HUD on the 3DS main gameplay screen. Like Link to the Past before it, Zelda Ocarina of Time's action-adventure gameplay loop is apply what you've learned using the items thus far acquired to complete a series of puzzles and challenges till you reach the next dungeon or boss or the credits. Ocarina has physics, and we see that fire disintegrates spider webs, water quenches the fire, slingshots can hit airborne targets, etc. Oh, and verticality allows for a big jump, and gravity is in effect. We leave the forest after a brief awkward moment with Saria, and for the first time we get a load of Hyrule Field. The cutscenes alone lend a significantly weightier and more profound aspect to the storytelling. Never been that invested in the minutiae of Zelda stories on the whole, but Link to the Past story went over my head for the most part. It's not just the story details that move me, but the speed, efficiency, and tone that the game presents itself with. So far, Ocarina is oozing with style. As we sat on my bedroom floor back in '98 with the manual, my only resource to get through, it took me all the first evening just to get to Hyrule Castle after beating the Great Deku Tree, and I remember being shocked at this point that the game was only just beginning. I can't stress enough, in 1998 this game felt enormous. That was the main takeaway, if any, that this is going to be a grand adventure. So Night 2 allowed us to sneak past the guard and fulfill the list of requirements that this game puts in your way before you're actually entering Dodongo's cavern. I don't recall how we figured it out, but somehow we did. One of the most cryptic aspects of the game's opening sequence is the requirement to learn Saria's song, back in the forest and in the Lost Woods, before Darunia will give you the Goron bracelet. This part of the game has given me trouble as an adult after long breaks from the game, but somehow that first night I must have wanted to see Link turn adult pretty bad, because we were throwing bombs and entering Dodongo's cavern before the rental period was over, that Thanksgiving break. And Chad and I were both N64 owners, yet both of us had slightly different tastes, and I always remember my boy telling me he didn't really care for Ocarina. OOT was well known to gamers at that time. It was a big deal to video games in general, so even kids who weren't necessarily Zelda fans like my friend knew about this game. Everyone knew it was going to be a big title, but none of us knew how incredible it would turn out to be. So the night Chad expressed his non-enthusiasm for OOT, and I might have been less secure about my opinions and tastes at the time, but I remember not caring about his opinion. This game was for me. I knew it wasn't for him, so it was all good. Chad said the game was too kiddie and too whimsical, too childish. I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but that was his point, that I was all good for me. Nobody has to like what I like. But my homeboy was missing out. We returned OOT that weekend after having beaten the Deku Tree, met Malon, Talon, Zelda, Impa, and Ganondorf, and it'd be several long weeks before my true copy, my gold collector's edition OOT, was in my hands and I'd have the chance to continue my adventure. It's important to remember that games as cinematic experiences, video games as genuine replacements for Hollywood action films and blockbuster epics, we're not quite here yet. Games were by and large short experiences, and cinematography in games was still being tried, attempted, failed, and tried some more. But once a CD-ROM took hold, cheesy FMV became rather common on Saturn and PS1, along with Sega CD, 3DO, and Jaguar before it. Ocarina and the N64 were different. The cutscenes for Ocarina are all rendered exactly the same way the rest of the game is. In other words, every cutscene is essentially pre-programmed gameplay being executed by the N64 in real time every time the game runs. Cutscenes in OOT are all identical to the gameplay as a result, giving the game a cohesive, albeit less flashy look. I'm thrilled that Nintendo went this route. It allowed the game to age much more gracefully than it would have otherwise. Imagine if they'd used FMV cutscenes for Ocarina. The original game wouldn't be nearly as elegant nowadays with the forms that it takes. It were loaded down with dated low-res, good for their time but bad now FMV cutscenes a la this game's obvious arch-rival and nemesis, Final Fantasy VII. Famously, the Super NES was home to the acclaimed Final Fantasy series until its N64 CD-free spec sheet caused a rift between Square and Nintendo that culminated in Nintendo's new flagship console, the N64, losing the title outright to the Sony PlayStation. This was a tough blow. The N64 was used to losing quality third-party support at this point, but Final Fantasy VII really stung. Nintendo's own marketing reassured me that quality over quantity was the way to go. Nintendo was really in my head back then when I stop and think about it. Something about the 90s VHS extreme sports loving play it loud aesthetic just speaks to my soul. The fact that Squaresoft's Final Fantasy VII was such a massive hit on the PlayStation only made it hurt that much more for Nintendo. One of 7's features that hasn't aged very gracefully are the FMVs. The resolution and art style cause it to be heavily dated. The FMV's movies are created by separate people with separate tools, and the final FMV interpretation of FF7 are still amazing, but there's a clear disconnect between the characters and their funky art styles in the game versus their more elegant early CGI models. I always wondered what was up with that. It wasn't until I knew more about how games are made and why they're made the way they are that I understand the reasons behind Cloud needing to be a lower poly version of himself during the main gameplay. Understanding the PS1 and N64's unique hardware limitations make me appreciate the 5th generation of consoles that much more. This was an era where you had Rockstar dev teams figuring the shit out for the very first time, and their choices were go big and fulfill the enormous fan and industry expectations, or go home. And the resultant games are often masterpieces. For Shigeru and crew, correctly portraying their characters in 3D space was a challenge to solve, an egg to crack. Different teams had different approaches before this stuff was in any way standardized. I think Nintendo knew they had to get it right the first time, and so they did. It's what excites me about the 5th gen so much. Nintendo and Rare, Sony and Square, the weight of the gaming world's expectations were on their shoulders, and they just simply delivered. That's why I respect these 90s Japanese dev teams so much. There's something really badass about revolutionizing an industry, fulfilling a promise like that amongst an eager fan base, and having the results. The games just totally mesmerize gamers worldwide. 3D games were really done right first by Nintendo, before there were Unreal Engine or GitHub. Ocarina fans have long awaited a second remake to 2011's Ocarina of Time 3D, but one is yet to materialize, amid a growing body of homebrew and fan-built modern ports. The tools exist, it's just a matter of time now before we're totally awash in a sea of fantastic N64 ports on PC, Mac, and Linux, Android, and iOS. We're fast approaching that point already with apps like Ship of Arkinian, and I do indeed love to play Ship. It's my go-to for original Ocarina, of course, as it should be for most people who care about performance and quality of life options. My actual go-to, and what you see featured in this video, is Ocarina 3D. I'm unable to pipe real hardware to the screen at the moment, but even if I could, I would still play the game like this on Lime 3DS, which is a fork of Citra. In 2017, I was getting myself back into games after a several-year hiatus. The Switch was a no-brainer, whereas the 3DS was a Nintendo system I'd never really played. I knew it had an awesome library that included both N64 Zelda titles. In 2018, that's when I finally bought one. I went with a new 2DS XL blue-black version, which was perfect for me as I had little interest in the 3D effect and mainly just wanted a newer, powerful Nintendo handheld that could run some modern games. And the 3DS just happened to have my favorite game ever. Totally touched up, beautifully remastered by the team known as Grezzo, Nintendo's ace in the hole. Grezzo's Ocarina of Time 3D remaster is essentially a one-to-one of the original, with the primary difference being the main game screen now presents in a more modern 15:9 widescreen aspect ratio, features significant quality of life changes and improvements to the UI, and due to the addition of the 3DS's touchscreen, has an overall cleaner presentation, brand new font and menu system, cleaned up and skippable text, improved frame rate that locks on to 30 FPS. The major overarching and most dramatic change to the game is the complete graphical overhaul, redone models and updated and improved textures all around that really just transform the game entirely. Character models are redrawn and reimagined, aimed at a more Disney vibe as seen in the game's manual art. And that includes redrawn enemies, locations, and items in the game, along with subtle audio enhancements and re-recordings and reinterpretations of the game's score. In addition, one of the most dated aspects of the original, and half the reason to play the 3DS version, is the static 2D backgrounds that serve as in-between zones in a few locations around Hyrule, a la Resident Evil. The two in Hyrule Castle Square, the drawbridge entrance and the garden outside the Temple of Time, are the most egregious examples, and they just look bad. The N64's output was somewhere around 240p, so you have to cut it some slack, but the 3DS version is refreshingly modern, replaces static backgrounds with full 3D models and maps for everywhere in the game now, and this goes a long way toward keeping the game feeling modern and playable. Plus it just looks so much better. 3DS's second screen is really not ideal for porting the game to PC, but I find the mouse an elegant enough solution so long as you equip non-combat items to the virtual buttons, which are labeled 1 and 2 on your inventory screen. The 3DS remake of Ocarina is beautiful, clean, and impressive all around. The game looks and feels and plays extremely faithfully to the original, with fans commonly citing that OOT 3D looks the way OG Ocarina looked and felt to play when it was new. And I wholeheartedly agree that it does generally look the way that the original Ocarina looked to gamers back then. So I had my black 3DS while working at Goodwill as a donation attendant for the winter, and having Ocarina on a handheld allowed me to complete my self-imposed challenge of beating the game every year. I've been a PC user since I hooked up my 486 as an 8-year-old, so I was familiar with apps like Nesticle, SNES 9X, and Ultra HLE, Project 64, but playing Ocarina on my computer was still a bit of a novelty. I had played and beaten OOT on Project 64 years before, but I knew I didn't have a PC capable of running 3DS games at the time, so my only option to play this version was a real 3DS. And I'm glad I did, because it was the first time I spent with the 2DS that got me back into Nintendo in a big way. In addition to Ocarina 3D, got to experience Mario Land 3D, Mario Kart 7, Majora's Mask 3D. Pretty soon I was back in love with Nintendo all over again, and just in time for the Switch to be the new hotness on the scene. Getting acquainted with Ocarina 3D made it my default version to this day, but I tend to go back and forth between 3D and Ship of Arcinian now. I do see the appeal of running the OG game in all its glory, but for me the UI improvements and overall graphical cohesiveness are what make 3D my gold standard. And I said graphical cohesion and not fidelity, because a funny thing happens as you crank the resolution on an N64 game into the stratosphere. All the seams and visual tricks that the devs use to hide the fact that it's a video game become extra apparent, and the game gets really ugly really fast in a way that's very unflattering to the N64 games. The correct approach to this problem with actual N64 titles is to upsample textures and then downsample everything back to a resolution that every element in the game can exist at naturally. And at that point your graphics are blockier and more jaggy, but the overall image coheres graphically in the same way it would through a CRT or on actual hardware back then. N64 games looked like they had more defined depth, and the geometry and visual tricks were dialed in for a CRT, and there's just no substitute for seeing N64 games the way they were meant to be seen. The N64 community offers the next best thing with releases like Zelda 64 and Ship of Arcinian, where the game is presented as cleanly as possible with the original game assets in a manner similar to what I just described. When I don't feel like operating the mouse for an entire playthrough, I board the ship. But the trade-off between using a mouse to control part of your inventory or mapping every item in Ocarina Note to a controller button is pretty much a draw. The original UI is a little clunky and busy, but considering how much is going on, they did an amazing job with it. The 3DS splits the game into 2 screens and dedicates the second screen entirely to inventory management or the game's quest status. And as much as I love the 3DS, I'm not really a fan of playing long games on like a 3-inch display, so it's emulation for me. Citra and its current predecessor Lime 3DS have been stalwart classics for some time now, even before I had a PC that could really run Ocarina 3D. My 2014 Mac Mini can get through an entire playthrough on Citra at 2x resolution without too many issues. Big part of wanting to build this gaming rig that I sit and make this video on was just frustration at not being able to run OOT or Link Between Worlds on any of the spec'd out Dell Optiplexes that I used to have. These were all productivity machines, so none of them had VRAM. 3DS emulation on Citra is mildly demanding, but nothing crazy. It mostly just feels good now to have a PC that can run anything I throw at it. So yeah, it's nice to be able to run this version of Ocarina on a machine that barely breaks a sweat doing it. Something about playing an old Mac was cool and I could do it, but it felt crappy to be taxing a system that hard throughout an entire 15 to 20 hour playthrough. This self-assembled water-cooled Asus rig that I'm using right now has been instrumental in facilitating my passion for Ocarina of Time, as now I'm able to comfortably play the 3DS version on a large display and make videos about it. During my inaugural playthrough with my buddy Chad, we'd only ever got to Dodongo's cavern, and we hadn't made it out of there, and I wouldn't until the game was officially in my hands. I'm one of the little bastards that got their hands on a pre-order copy of Ocarina of Time Collector's Edition from Toys R Us, and here's a story that may irritate N64 collectors. I was a proud owner of the gold cart, played it, loved it. Around '09, I sold off my entire childhood collection, including all the N64 games, and I didn't even bother to sell Ocarina Collector's Edition in its original N64 box, and I had that in the attic, fully preserved in mint condition, no less. I was just too lazy to go up there and grab it or any of the other 30 boxes for the Super NES, N64, and Game Boy. But in my defense, I'm not sure the used game store would have wanted the box back then, because times were a little different and those games were not quite as sacred as they are today. Last year, I deeply regretted selling my gold copy of OOT without the box and manual, so I completed my descent into madness and sold all of the game boxes to a guy on Facebook. But he still didn't believe these were real boxes even after looking at them in person for what felt like an hour. He eventually came to his senses and realized that I didn't try and sell him 30 fake high-res game boxes for $100, so he gave me my money and we parted ways. But having the box and manual for Ocarina Collector's Edition, but not the cartridge, just always served as a reminder of the fact that I sold my game, and so I think that's why it was therapeutic to get rid of it. As I'm sitting here recording and editing this, I'm kind of realizing that making this retrospective is my way of paying respect back to Ocarina of Time after having disrespected it by selling my original copy. My initial playthrough with my cart and my save file was during a blustery gray weather Christmas break spent with my dad and grandpa in Louisiana. A large portion of my gaming growing up was done at my grandpa's farmhouse out in the country in southern Louisiana, where the TVs were always old, but as long as I had an RF adapter, I was good to go. I could always hook up the systems, and by the N64 I knew that I would need both composite and RF connectors for my different houses that I'd be playing at. But I always gamed at my grandpa's house. I had this thing back then where every time I'd visit the country for a few days, I'd get anxiety about being off the grid, especially growing up in a high-tech metropolis like Houston where the internet was already everywhere, and you'd visit the sticks and realize that ubiquitous connectivity was just an illusion. I quickly made it back to the place I'd left off on Blockbuster's copy, which saw me obtaining the bombs as a permanent inventory item, then dropping a pair of them into the eyes of a giant reptile statue in the main chamber area, then entering through its mouth to face off with King Dodongo, the game's second boss. We chuck a bomb directly into Dodongo's mouth, wait for the muffled blast after he swallows it, then roll past him before he can steamroll us. We make our way back around the circuit, rinse and repeat. So far, none of the fights have been difficult per se, as they're basically extensions of the primary challenge of the main dungeon. They serve as a culmination and send-off to each one, with every successful victory netting us a whole heart piece and a spiritual stone. Link finds himself back at the summit of Death Mountain, and a cute little scene takes place with the Gorons. The race of rock eaters appear happy and carefree once again, at least for now. The tone remains lighthearted, and Link is sent off by Darunia and the smaller Gorons. The Gorons are understandably grateful, and they thank Link and try to give him a hug before he runs away. Already the game has packed a lot of charm and character into the world building aspect. Back at the incline area of the mountain, we scour back up to the top using bombs to blow the boulders out of our way. We get to the top of Death Mountain after killing some skulltulas and blast open the side of the mountain to reveal the first fairy fountain. So the fairy model still looks pretty rough even in the 3DS version, and I'm not sure there's much that Grezzo could have done with the original design. We got pretty used to seeing blocked out low poly messes like this, and games like Tomb Raider illustrate how difficult it must have been to recreate a woman's curves with just a few polygons. So we get a magic meter from this fairy, and the owl, Kapora Gabora, who we have previously met but I did not mention, gives us a lift back down the mountain. During the child section, there's a couple of prerequisites and items you'll want to obtain before advancing 7 years into the future and become an adult. So I chose to get those out of the way now for this run. Our next destination is Zora's River, but first we're going to stop off at this large structure in the middle of Hyrule, and we see that it's a ranch. We enter Lon Lon Ranch. There's a door on our left with a suspiciously Italian-looking man who is Malon's father, and he offers to give us the chance to win this bottle with milk in it by playing the Find the Chicken game. I uncovered the 3 chickens on the very first try for the first time ever in my history with this game. Ha, what a feeling. And this has traditionally been a bottle that I've skipped, but nowadays I always get this bottle because it's so easy to do. I quickly make my way to the center of the ranch and get acquainted with Talon and learn Epona's song. So Epona is technically optional in the game, but I've never even considered skipping her. It's one of those features that just made perfect sense in a Zelda game. She speeds up the pace, expedites the quest, and adds to the overall impact of the story. The collision may be pretty dated and clunky nowadays, but for its time, it was a pretty damn majestic and fun way to gallop all over Hyrule with Epona. The 3DS version in particular looks really beautiful at certain times of day when you're on horseback, where the increased fidelity and the sunset and sunrise effects see the sky turn all sorts of pinks and oranges. Finally, to the right of Kakarot Village is the obstacle course-like pathway to Zora's River. You'll find cuckoos, octoroks, and a fat bean salesman, and if you're crafty, you can use a supplied cuckoo to obtain a whole half a heart in the form of 2 heart pieces, but I only managed to get the first one before I dropped my cuckoo. Once again, we bust out the Fairy Ocarina and play the Royal Melody to gain access to Zora's domain, and we head through the waterfall. Here again, Koji Kondo blesses our game and sets the mood perfectly with the theme track to Zora's domain, a watery, warbled, peaceful trance of a melody that feels mysterious and like home at the same time. First thing we have to do is complete a diving minigame, so we do that and we climb back up, grab our scale, then once again dive back into the pool at the bottom of the water and make our way out to a new area entirely, which is Lake Hylia. This looks to be a whole nother section of the game, but for now we're just here for this message in a bottle, and we scoot right back into the hole underwater and run upstairs to show King Zora. I've heard people complain about the way you open Jabu Jabu's mouth in this game being cryptic, and I would agree if the game didn't tell you what to do, but this is in line with other RPGs and adventure games that Nintendo's put out, so the game does tell you what to do, you just have to go out of your way to ask. To me, RPGs were new and fascinating, and calling Ocarina of Time an RPG, as game magazines did, was enough for me to consider it one my whole life. Although these days I know the difference between a true JRPG and an action-adventure RPG, and I love both types of games for different reasons. I think Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma must have known and understood the differences too, because Ocarina of Time certainly wouldn't have had the same impact with the general public. Turn-based RPGs as a genre were seen as having limited appeal and a limited audience in the West, as the discontinuity of the numbered Final Fantasy releases demonstrates. JRPGs can be mechanically engrossing in their own way, but the obvious choice was to implement live-action physical combat in Ocarina of Time. Nobody could have predicted how well they pulled it off, but to this day the mocap work and the original animations look fantastic. That being said, I don't necessarily think action-adventure RPGs like Ocarina of Time are superior to JRPGs outright. I think traditional turn-based games will remain popular. The 90s were pretty much the heyday of the JRPG on the Super NES, and it doesn't appear that turn-based games are going anywhere anytime soon. The Lord Jabu Jabu's belly offers the steepest challenge yet for Child Link, and even with a Prima official strategy guide, I initially had trouble finding the right hole to chase Ruto down. Nowadays it's second nature, but Jabu Jabu's belly is the first dungeon that can get a bit labyrinthian, and just like in real life, your eyes will have to map and memorize your surroundings, so traversal is aided by the HUD minimap, which shows a basic floor plan style outline of each and every dungeon chamber in the game, for the remake remains on the 3DS screen, among few other elements, and once you get the compass for the dungeon you're in, a yellow arrow appears on your map, indicating your current position on the map, and a red arrow showing the door that was just entered. The minimap becomes rather necessary for certain rooms, as you'll likely end up getting doors and entrances mixed up at some point. You know I couldn't wait to complete the child section, just with the knowledge of what was to come after pulling the Master Sword out of its pedestal. I had castle Lego sets as a kid, and I always had a soft spot for swords, shields, knights, and high fantasy and the like. But in video games, high fantasy never appealed to me the way a game like Pokemon does. Pokemon and Zelda share the same basic formula when you break it down, so the two are essentially different iterations of the same classic idea. The player avatar, Link or Red, both capture that thing, whatever it is, that makes it special to be a young kid in his bedroom getting ready to embark on this adventure of a lifetime, where the biggest challenges, obstacles, and achievements of your life lie just outside your bedroom door. There's something really fun and satisfying about Red interacting with the Super NES before anything else in the game, just to set the mood. Pokemon and Zelda both tell essentially the same story and feature the same character more or less, and the player is then asked to draw in the blank, so it's far easier for me to do that in the world of Pokemon because it basically depicts modern day Japan 30 years ago, something that actually existed concurrently in my lifetime. But regardless, the story itself is as old as time. I suppose Kanto certainly feels more plausible than Hyrule in its interdimensional sages, so that's probably the appeal to me. And regardless of setting, Zelda and Pokemon games both offer completely self-contained little worlds which serve as a proxy version of reality. The leap to 3D for the Zelda series meant that Hyrule would be less approximate and far more literal. This philosophy of game design that Nintendo and Miyamoto employed was to strip away as much extraneous detail as possible while still retaining the essence of something. Like the desert world, World 2 in Mario Bros. 3, everything that makes it a desert is there, even if the sprites are a little crude. Back in the belly of the beast, Jabu Jabu, the sacred Zora's guardian, we complete our hardest series of puzzles yet. We remove the tentacles that plague these intestinal walls, and after traversing the pink stomach-lining rooms, you end up fighting Barinade, a boss that requires you to spam the boomerang until you can clear enough jellyfish out of the way, then you go in for the kill, slash, and repeat, and you're back outside in the water with Ruto, where a sweet little cutscene takes place. Ruto makes Link her future husband, and then does a super cool little animation sequence to spit out the water emerald toward Link. The child section appears to be done now. You've obtained the 3 spiritual stones, you've learned Zelda's lullaby, Epona song, and the Song of Time, you've gathered up a small arsenal of kid-friendly weapons, and some bombs. The Temple of Time looks incredible in the 3DS version, with the subtle reflections on the polished marble floor giving this particular room some sparkle as we place the stones at the altar and then we walk up to the pedestal and press A. As soon as we see Link again, our body looks different. We've grown into the body of a 17-year-old, and this part of the game is what made it all worth it thus far. I wanted nothing more than to experience this game as the final adult form of Link, so in a way this is where the game really got started for me. The child section felt pretty big, so the adult section is going to be incredible. We run out of the temple through the castle town square where Redeads loiter the now haunted wasteland. Again, the reworked 3DS maps class the game up nicely, and our inventory is starting to fill out quite a bit. The slingshot and boomerang are not accessible as adult Link. If I had to guess, it's because the animation code required for using all that doesn't exist for adult Link. At first, I assumed you could cause some havoc by abusing the time travel mechanic in Ocarina, but eventually I realized how the game really operates. The world has 2 different periods of time, and the Temple of Time is nothing more than a glorified switch to go between those 2 separate game worlds. There are a few specific in-game moments and elements that explicitly get affected or triggered in Ocarina, and you'll see said effects in the alt timeline, but there's not a lot of real mechanical depth to the time travel outside of this. Character NPC dialogue is either one or the other, and there's no real engine or mechanic that creates interesting effects due to the actions you perform in one time or the other. For all intents and purposes, every object, item, and element that's not part of the level itself lives on borrowed time in the game's memory, and the only evidence of any past gameplay when you boot up a save file will be Link's current age, young or old, and the amount of items in your inventory. That's pretty much it. When I was younger, my technical ignorance served to maintain the illusion. So at this point in the game, where you actually turn into adult Link, meet the character Sheik for the first time, and a long time ago this was a spoiler, but everybody knows the drill by now. This little surprise element where Zelda's identity is revealed would return to Wind Waker, and I always love that, even if Pirate Captain Zelda turns into a lame-o after she gets the royal treatment. Sheik serves as an adjunct to Navi, where Navi guides the basic gameplay and Sheik acts as one of the narrators. Miyamoto and Aonuma dropped hints in the form of Sheik's hips in her walk, posture, and mannerisms. It's clearly feminine and demure. I don't think I noticed it back then, but it's cool in retrospect how much detail they crammed in on the first try in 3D. The game does make a pretty big deal out of dropping you back off in control of Link 7 years later, and you can tell from the way Link holds his Master Sword and gives it a little twist that he's supposed to be just as shocked by this as we are. But more than anything, the game has given the players a chance to take it all in. Link has matured into a full-bore, legit heartthrob, complete with little silver hoops on his elven ears. I don't really know much about elves aside from this game and whatever depictions there are in pop culture, but Hylians are elves apparently, and most of the character models have been fleshed out nicely in 3D as well. The Zelda series creators and artists were dialing in this world, dialing aspects of Link, Zelda, Ganon, and Hyrule that would persist until today. Zoras were in Link to the Past, but they were depicted as garish, cartoonish fish monsters, and in Ocarina, the Zora race is a svelte, demure, fish-like humanoid people with wants, desires, and a story all their own. Same with the Gorons, who are my favorite to make their debut here. They're lovable, goofy, but strong and proud and peace-loving. Their sympathetic depiction at Death Mountain in OOT establishes the Goron race for the entire series going forward. To this day, the Gorons are fundamentally depicted the way they were in Ocarina of Time. This game iterated on lots of Zelda 3's tropes and simultaneously expanded the world and fleshed out earlier ideas, concepts, and enemies that it all added up to Ocarina's Hyrule being one of the most charming and vibrant virtual worlds ever created. Something that's routine nowadays, but it's thanks to this game. Mario 64 was like a lunar footprint for Nintendo, boldly declaring that Nintendo and its primary mascot had arrived in 3D. Nobody could have guessed how big of a win Mario 64 would end up being for Nintendo, but early on I think gamers, including myself, were just relieved that they'd managed to stick the landing. Mario 64 was earth-shattering, but almost 2 years on, and Zelda was the game everyone knew was going to be, had to be big. A lot was riding on Ocarina of Time not sucking. Nintendo and the Zelda series and its creators' rep were on the line. In retrospect, it almost seems like Miyamoto and the boys saw no alternative to the game being anything other than a 10 out of 10. As big a deal as we make about the N64 and its graphics, audio fidelity was equally critical to get right. It goes without saying that Koji Kondo's work is brilliant throughout, but something about the 40-something tracks that make up the world of Ocarina of Time is just extra on point. When you think about the fact that Kondo limited himself in his compositions to just the notes you can play on the ocarina, it's even more impressive. In a 2005 interview with Nintendo Power, he said the following: "I had to create all of those memorable tunes with only 5 tones on the classic do-re-mi scale. Specifically, re, fa, la, and ti, and the higher scale re. Since each of those songs, like Zelda's Lullaby or Epona's song, had a particular theme, it was quite challenging, but I think it all felt really natural in the end. And as soon as I was finished with those ocarina songs, I had to create even more for Majora's Mask. I got a lot of mileage out of just 5 tones." There's a lot you can do with just 5 notes in general, but I enjoy that little glimpse into the mind of a creative genius. I suspect that in Kondo's case, the limitation might actually have fostered expression rather than diminish it, but who knows. I know that creative limitations do have a habit of sparking innovation. There's a few tasks we gotta complete before we can head back to Kokiri Forest and take on the first dungeon. Ocarina makes the most out of its world map, which was massive for the time, but quaint nowadays. There's a fair amount of backtracking throughout the adventure, which is fine because the game does a good job of hiding it. Sure, backtracking is a cheap tactic to reuse maps and assets, but one can forgive Ocarinas. There's a few back and forth fetch quests early on, but it's never too egregious. Most locations that you visit will be connected to their respective dungeon, and there's generally an item or event that the player must trigger in order for the game's plot to advance. The whole game is effectively broken down into a world map with 3D characters who can interact in a few different ways. All enemies are able to be engaged with projectiles, bombs, sticks, deku nuts, and bottles, and a sword slash giving damage and the shield preventing damage or reflecting a projectile back toward the enemy. And NPCs have the same type of collision detection as enemies, but can only be talked to by pressing the action button, or A on the N64 controller. Context-sensitive actions were notable and well implemented, as they freed up the rest of the N64's button layout for the massive cache of weapons that Link somehow carries around everywhere he goes. One thing I've always loved about video games is the ability to carry an absurd amount of weapons and ammo on a character without so much as a pocket bulging out. When discussing the final game's mechanics, auto-jumping seemed a little odd at first, but I totally get why they did it now, and I can't imagine Ocarina of Time without it. In general, Link's slower, more deliberate movement and speed, plus his extensive inventory served to nicely differentiate the game's mechanics from Mario 64's. Legend has it that Mario 64's engine was the Ocarina engine at first, but by the time it was released, Miyamoto considered Ocarina's a separate engine entirely. The final product reflects as much, and I think the heavily modified Mario 64 engine was a smart choice. 3D engines might have come a long way since 1998, but the fact remains Link controls in the 3D space more or less exactly how you'd want and expect him to, without any catches or caveats. It's been pretty apparent that they got the fundamentals right from the very beginning. In a way, this video exists because I've always been fascinated at how OOT works on a technical level. After trekking to the graveyard and racing Dampé for the hookshot, we make our way back through the Lost Woods to the now cleverly reused meadow area where we first met Saria. It's 7 years on, and this is now the entrance to the Forest Temple. Deku scrubs have been replaced by some crappy looking moblins, and I had to think about this enemy to figure out what it was. They seem vaguely pig-like, so they're moblins. The Forest Temple has some killer music. Puzzle-wise, it's fairly basic dungeon fare, dark and oppressive, creepy, foreboding, but I remember how excited I was to get the bow for the first time. My long-standing story I always tell myself is that I must have thought the fairy bow in Ocarina was pretty cool because I went into the woods and tried to make one in between gaming sessions back then. The wooden bow had some really great CGI for the time, as the pseudo-realistic yet cartoony look they ended up with did a really great job, even with 1998 textures and resolutions, at making the wooden bow look cool. The bottle just looks neat regardless. I think it was the 3D shadows and simple yet realistic lines that simply caught my eye. I'm not sure what the word is for when you really just love something purely for its aesthetic, but that's what's happening here with the items in Ocarina of Time. And I'm talking about either version, by the way. They just have this succulent, mouth-watering look to them. It's like I want to eat them. A big element of which games I prefer come down to art style. I think it's fair to say that Ocarina and Majora, along with Wind Waker, Link to the Past, Skyward Sword, and even Smash Bros, just have that classic look for Link. I like the character models in Smash Ultimate. It's a modernized, improved version of Link's character model from OOT. We obtain the fairy bow, and pretty soon we've defeated Phantom Ganon, who Ganon calls a worthless puppet and banishes to the gap between dimensions. The dialogue in the game is pretty good, nothing crazy. As you can guess, once you've played OOT enough times, you basically never care to read the text unless it's a choice you have to make, but most of those are just you saying yes and affirming whatever the NPC is asking of you. Regardless, there are several points in the game where a lore dump is occurring, and you've still got to hit A or B to make the scenes play out. The OG game in its unmodified form has some pretty egregious text box behavior. It's too slow and not able to be sped past, and it's a forgivable but still serious oversight considering how easy it would have been to program this in. Case in point, Ship of Harkinian has text behaving like it always should have by default, and something tells me that the people who made OOT didn't anticipate the game having as extended of a lifespan as it does. Either way, the 3DS version has improved text box behavior from the get-go, albeit without Ship of Harkinian's ability to speed past mass blocks of dialogue in a single go. Both versions offer much needed quality of life upgrade in the text department, and I stick with the 3DS version despite it being overall slower with the text speed. After leaving the forest on foot, with our first medallion in tow, we stop off at Lon Lon Ranch again to find that Ingo, Malon's taller, skinnier, dark-haired, mustache-wearing brother, is the new manager, and he's a real dickhead. It's pretty apparent that he's not treating any of his horses well, including Epona, so you hand over 50 rupees and he has you do some equestrian training. Just make sure each fence gets a little rupee symbol when you jump over it, and talk to Ingo before the timer ends, and you'll be racing him for Epona in no time. Since Ingo's an asshole, he locks you inside the ranch after you win your horse back fair and square. And famously, the player is faced with this dilemma that has a really satisfying solution. Everything's a puzzle in Ocarina of Time, and unlocking Epona is done literally by busting her out of jail. What a cool moment in the game, and what a great way to create instant bond between you and your trusty steed. They do a great job of making Epona the shit. You really care about her in this game, and to this day I admire the majesty of real horses when I'm in one's presence. They are magical creatures, and the game does a good job of depicting that special bond. Unlocking Epona, like the running shoes in Pokemon, is your fast travel upgrade. Keeping the player slow until they find an upgrade is brilliant, as the game begins to feel easier to traverse the deeper you go into the story. It was slow going at first, but now the pace has picked up considerably. 2011's OOT 3D remains one of the cleanest remasters I've ever played, and yet I'm still aware that most people nowadays love the look of the original. I do too, and I admit I'm spoiled, but honestly I love them both for different reasons. When it comes to any Nintendo game of this caliber that I consider indispensable to my life, I seek out a premier alpha version for myself, and I consider both Ship of Harkinian and Ocarina 3D to be my current gold standard. The 3DS version does look closer today to how OOT was perceived when it came out. I also like to play a vanilla version of the game without all the toggles and cheats like Ship has, as I often can't resist and end up cheapening my playthrough by altering Link's inventory. It is fun to modify Link's tunic and hair color and witness what could have been with just a few hex value changes. I love mods, and yet there's something wonderful about leaving a game entirely alone and letting Nintendo's intended experience take hold. We make our way to the top of the Fire Temple, which takes full advantage of the Z-axis by shepherding you along, scaling the height of the temple bit by bit, and the puzzles are getting slightly more complex, and the game continues asking you to use your most recent acquisition, in this case the fire hammer that the dungeon rewards your hard work with. promptly after we test out our new tool on some nearby stones, the game notifies you organically to keep smashing stuff with your hammer, and back in the firewall room, a suspicious platform gives way, falls through the floor, and so do we. Getting to freefall from this height really drives home the true scale and physicality of the Fire Temple. Freefall is a thrill as we get to see the structure of the temple from top to bottom in one fell swoop. It looks awesome. We rescue all the Gorons, gather up all the keys, and finally go back to the first room of the temple to enter the boss room where we proceed to bludgeon the dragon Volvagia to death. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. In no time at all, we're back at the summit of Death Mountain once again, and our next destination will be a change of pace. Death Mountain has fulfilled the game's lava biome, and it provided a nice set of browns and reds to contrast the lush greens of the forest. Nintendo understands how to use color effectively to differentiate its set pieces, and the next part of the quest has us needing the iron boots. The water temple's next, but at this point in the game, I stopped to initiate one of the game's side quests, and the only optional side quest in the game that I do on most playthroughs. The Master Sword looks amazing in this game, but we want the Biggoron sword. A two-handed behemoth that approaches Buster Sword territory in terms of comedic effect. Link has to do a trading sequence to get the Biggoron sword, and at this point in the game we've acquired everything we need save for a blue flame to get this quest done in record time. I've already prepared by buying and planting a magic bean at the base of Death Mountain, which will be crucial for the final step of the trading quest. We talk to Anju and get the regular cuckoo, take that up to Malin, go back to Anju, get a blue kojiri, and the trading quest has officially begun. Some of these sections are timed, but most aren't, and you can't play any Ocarina songs in warp, so it's all foot and horse travel, and that's cool with me. We hightail it to the Lost Woods, but take a left instead of a right, and when you enter you'll find this negative creep. He has some of the strange and slightly disturbing dialogue found in a few places in the game. Ocarina is not a dark game, but there are some disturbing themes and encounters throughout your adventure, and Props to Nintendo for always giving kids the benefit of the doubt and assuming that young kids are ready for slightly darker themes. Respecting kids' intelligence is how to keep them as customers for life. So we get an odd mushroom, and then we gotta race back to the potion shop behind the regular shop in Kakariko Village. This being the first time section, it has to be daytime when you enter Kakariko, but otherwise it's a piece of cake as long as you know where the shop is. These sections used to give me anxiety until I realized it's pretty hard to mess up if you do everything you're supposed to. Get the odd poultice from the hag, run back to the forest to find a little blonde kokery girl in the carpenter's son's place. She trades you the poultice for a poacher's saw. And I'll mention that you want to have the sun song in case it's night when you run up to Kakariko. Now with the saw in hand, we race across the world map, clean over to the other side of it, and the most intriguing late area of the game, the one ahead that we've not seen yet, Gerudo Desert. Back to Nintendo and their biomes, you see what they're doing here. Mario games feature meadows and deserts and oceans, grasslands and jungles too. Video games have long attempted to simulate different biomes, and Ocarina is the best example of this I've seen to date. Gerudo has the right N64 style pseudo lighting and the right textures to give us that New Mexico Joshua Tree, Wile E. Coyote, and Roadrunner Southwest arid desert vibe. We meet the master craftsman after having leapt across the chasm of Gerudo Valley with Epona. The game shows a sweet little cutscene that activates generously so long as you approach the jump with enough speed. There are several obvious Skulltula around the carpenter's tent at night. I take a chance and grab as many as I can while they're out because I usually never get more than 30 anyway, but I wanted to upgrade the wallet as soon as possible because 200 rupees is lame when you're collecting hundreds and hundreds of wasted ones past that point. We get a broken giant's knife from the carpenter and now we head back to Death Mountain. Meet Biggoron himself at the top, the same place we met Kapora Gabora, the magic fairy, and the entrance to the fire temple. Biggoron lives across the way and he's got eye problems until we take his RX to King Zora. In the future, the king is encased in red ice, and at this point I realized that I had totally forgotten I needed the blue ice to free King Zora before I could proceed with the trading quest. I lost my bearings a bit, but luckily I remembered a streaming buddy who reminded me to take the shortcut next time I beat the ice cavern. You can waste time in a game's only snowy biome if you don't move with some conviction, so I forced my way through the ice cavern's puzzles, grabbed 3 bottles full of blue fire, and began my escape. This time, after knocking out all the relevant puzzles and doing my best to avoid those annoying snow trooper enemies that look like chess pieces and freeze you in place, I do find the shortcut my guide told me about, and in no time flat, I make it back to King Zora, thaw him out, taking care not to boil him, and he hands part of the eye drop ingredients, a frog who we've got to take over to the Lakeside Laboratory scientists. Lake Hylia is one of my favorite locations in the game because of the Lakeside Laboratory, the scientists, and just how cool the building and the shark is. The Ocarina devs didn't have to throw in that whole extra lab and scientists and put little Easter eggs in there, but they did. There's so many details in this game that just add up to an experience, but this world remains one where I never get tired of roaming around in, despite how empty and barren it seems today. It's comfy and cool. I'd happily live in VR Hyrule for a while anyways. So we make it with the frog, and at last we have the eye drops after giving scientists the frog. And now for the big one. The game's biggest hurdle yet. Before you can get the upgraded sword, we gotta race back to the top of Death Mountain to Biggoron's spot. The lily pad that sprouts from the beans we planted is key to making it in time, at least for me. I'm sure you can make it without the floating leaf shortcut, but I don't see why you'd want to. I usually make it with a minute or so to spare, a far cry from fellow streamer M. Wins, who managed to deliver the claim check to Biggoron with less than a second on the clock. And she made a YouTube short out of it. It was a tense moment, and it was awesome.
Get up, dude, get up! One second. 1 second. Literally 1 second, right? Oh my god. Wow, look.
So at long last, we hand biggoron the claim check, and I always play the Sun Song 6 or 7 times just to advance the time ahead 3 days, and hassle him a few times to collect our treasure. Biggoron's sword is probably the best item or upgrade in the entire game, and as I've demonstrated, can be acquired early in the adult section pretty much right before the water temple, since the blue flame and thus the ice cavern is required to unfreeze the fish king near the end of the quest. Biggoron's sword offers double damage for every sword attack in exchange for the slight annoyance of having to put the sword away before using the shield, as it requires a two-handed grip. I usually don't have any issues with the two-handed grip in the biggoron sword, but I did have a slight hiccup during the twin rover fight during this playthrough. And despite its lack of mystique, the big blade beats out the master sword and can now be used to one-shot a lot of previously two-shot enemies. It's worth it because not only does Link look badass, but it rewards you handsomely for your efforts. The sword upgrades in Ocarina and Majora are one of my favorite parts of either game. There's something just so cool about acquiring the gold dust in Majora and racing to beat Snowhead on the first day to turn Snowhead to Spring, all just so you can forge your new Razor Sword into a permanent gilded sword before the clock resets on Termina. I'm not sure what they were thinking making the coolest sword in Majora's Mask, the Razor Sword, a temporary upgrade that you can't carry permanently. I mean, sure, the gilded sword is cool too, but man, that Razor Sword just did it for me. Clean, modern, utilitarian, industrial lines, and kind of reminds me of Cloud's Buster Sword once again. So with our upgrade in both hands, our next destination is the infamous Water Temple. Ocarina 3D has gotten some major competition from PC ports like Ship as of late, but short of some serious mod work, there's no substitute for the quality of life changes that Grezzo implemented into this version. Nowhere is this more apparent than the Water Temple, which now has 3 very bright, very visible markers that serve as guideposts for the player who would otherwise tend to get lost in a sea of mushy green and gray textures. The Water Temple can be a tad monotonous, and it's got to be hard to differentiate landmarks in a building with identical textures splattered on every wall. The Water Temple in OOT 3D is a much better experience, as I virtually never get lost anymore, so long as I remember those 2 pesky keys I always forget, where I make it to the last locked door right before the Morpha fight, and then realize what I've done, having to backtrack all the way to get just that one key. Backtracking in the Water Temple is a chore, and I ended up changing the water level 8 or 9 times before beating it. The Morpha fight is less memorable but fine. The real star of this dungeon is the mid-boss, featuring the game's Chanburo sword fight between you and Dark Link. And this is the essence of what Miyamoto-san wanted Zelda 64 to be. Much has been shared about Nintendo and its crew in the years leading up to Ocarina, as they attained inspiration from real-life Chanburo performance artists that featured real Japanese sword fighting. The team picked up on the fact that the actor doing the sword fighting was taking on one enemy at a time, a concept that would carry over into Ocarina's Z-targeting system. It'd be hard to imagine Ocarina without Z-targeting. The two go hand in hand. The combat in Wind Waker may have taken it up a notch slightly in my book, but the essential idea and mechanics were all here in Ocarina. With switch targeting enabled, one of my favorite mechanics in the game is locking onto a hostile enemy, leaving Link locked on, and then jumping backwards into an acrobatic flip, all without losing the target, and then jumping back forward for a sword slash by pressing the action button. This brings the Chanburo concept to life and probably remains one of Miyamoto's proudest achievements at the time. Successfully converting the drama and back and forth of an artful sword fight for each encounter is what makes the game fun. The enemies in Ocarina are satisfying to extinguish, and Wind Waker's might have edged out slightly, but controlling Link remains a joy to this day. Dark Link doesn't know how to handle a non-master sword. The fight is a little abrasive and weird, mostly because my attacks get blocked, but enough connect to eventually take him down. I'm in the habit of keeping a fairy or two in my bottles at all time to prevent unnecessary deaths, but the occasional game over does still happen. Morpha is probably one of the lamer bosses in the game. You know, water themes were tough for early 3D in general, and I'm just glad we got the blue water medallion and we can continue. Our inventory screen is getting pretty full by now, and there are really only 2 dungeons left save for Ganon's castle. The game has thus far masterfully done a lot with a little. We're back at Kakariko yet again for a cutscene that sees Sheik being swung around and manhandled by the creature spirit inhabiting the well. Adult Link initiates a paradox by learning the Song of Storms, one of my favorite tracks in the game, and at this point we start having to go back to the Temple of Time, changing back to Child Link. It's refreshing after tackling 3 adult dungeons to see Child Link again, to turn the world happy again and get to use our old weapons. The boomerang is a brilliant item, and it's a shame Adult Link doesn't know how to use it. Suppose the hook shot would have suffered as a result, so I guess game balance was the priority here. Under the well, as Child Link, we make a beeline for the other side of the sewer. We flip a switch and run back to the entrance to go downstairs for a fight with Dead Hand and his minions. This is the creepiest, freakiest, disturbing enemy in the game. There's something unsettling about the way the Dead Hand moves, and some scenes feel darker and creepier with the original graphics. The Lens of Truth is what we needed, and once we have it, the mini dungeon is over, and we can now grab the Master Sword and take on the Shadow Temple. The Shadow Temple is a little unique. It's the most linear level in the game, and it's not so much a puzzle box as a puzzle corridor, where you make your way through this oppressive, creepy, skull-ridden torture chamber with traps and guillotines and bad things intended for use on people. And it's disturbing indeed, but it's this part that didn't really register with me as a kid, that or it didn't scare me. Either way, I appreciate the detail that was put in service of fleshing out Hyrule. So you face off with a few Stalfos before the floating ship reaches the end of the track, and you gotta jump off and unlock the boss room that lies just beyond the next door. Bongo Bongo is the boss, and usually he gives me some trouble, but I do my best to stun both hands before he attacks me, and I take him out with a few quick arrows and target switches, combined with a lashing from the biggoron sword. I take Bongo Bongo out in record time personally, as this is the fastest I've ever beaten him, and in fact, last year I got several game overs at this fight when I last attempted to record footage and make a retrospective. The next stop, and the last major area in the game, sees us back out west into the interior of the desert this time, amongst a population of militant Gerudo women. The Gerudo thief girl explains that a male comes every so often, and in this timeline, Ganondorf is the chosen one. We must rescue a series of carpenters before we can gain the trust of the Gerudo women and obtain the membership card. This card allows us free travel amongst the Gerudo, and we rescue the 4 carpenters, and then happen upon an archery range where we do score over 1,000, but we stopped just short of 1,500 needed for the quiver upgrade. I'd bother to get it, but running out of arrows shouldn't be an issue during this playthrough, and in no time flat, we're pulling out the lens of truth, making our way through the stormy desert, and we end up at the game's final temple, the Spirit Temple, aka the Desert Colossus. Young Link is needed again for the final dungeon for a few early puzzles, and thankfully by now, we learn the Requiem of Spirit and we can warp directly to the Temple of Time now and switch ages, which, thank God. So we should be pretty accustomed to going to the Temple of Time and changing age at this point. You'll end up fast traveling 5 or 6 times toward the end of the game, and it shaves off a lot of unnecessary backtracking that would just feel cheap and senseless at this point of the game. The Spirit Temple, with its Far East Egyptian-style Indiana Jones-esque atmosphere, is most definitely my favorite dungeon in the game. It's cool that we've quested this far and have filled up our inventory so much. Link has most every tool in the game at his disposal now, and the Spirit Temple does its best to make use of each item and mechanic it can to throw the player off. One of the more annoying puzzles and enemies are the Anubis rooms. I always just run in circles until every Anubis gets smoked. Some of the later puzzles can get a little hectic. The zigzag wall puzzle with the roving spike traps can be bypassed entirely with a little creativity, and veteran OOT players will usually self-optimize their gameplay in service of their goal, which often means avoiding enemies, NPC dialogue, and generally only moving toward actions that directly move the game forward. I take the shortest, straightest path everywhere I can too, so my play is as efficient as it possibly can be. One shitty moment came at the sunblock torch room with the 5 silver rupees. A deku stick is required to complete the puzzle, and yet if you're out of them, you've gotta leave the fucking Spirit Temple to go get deku sticks. Jesus, man. That's not the first time this has happened during a playthrough. I usually leave infinite ammo on when I play Ship of Arcinian for this reason. So we mosey back to the giant indoor statue with the hands, and after gathering the final upgrade to Link's loadout, the coveted mirror shield, it's refreshing to change Link's shield in a similar manner that switching tunics does. One of the coolest parts of any Zelda game is the gradual but steady increase of Link's abilities and defense, and by the end of the game you can hardly recognize the character you started out with. Much like Pokemon, which sees an equally absurd amount of progress and upgrades held by Red as he makes his way around Kanto and arrives back where it all started. A few fairly straightforward puzzles complete the dungeon. There are mirror reflections, light puzzles, bomb shoe puzzles, rusty switch puzzles, hover boot puzzles, and regular bomb puzzles. Finally, we take on the mid-boss, which is the Dark Nut again. Like I had mentioned before, the two-handed biggoron sword did present a bit of a challenge for the Twin Robo fight, as it's hard to put your sword away after slashing in time to pull out the shield. So that's what you have to do for this fight. You have to pull the shield out repeatedly and then reflect with it, but then pull the sword out as well. So switching back and forth is the hard part. So at this point, late in the game, Sheik reveals herself as Zelda. And Zelda is now part of the fight with Link against Ganondorf, and we just kind of take it all in. We arrive back at the former site of Hyrule Castle, and finally we're entering the ominous driveway, and we run up the floating rainbow bridge to Ganon's castle. Damn. At this point in the game, Ocarina has delivered on its promise of grandeur with one final area to see and one final sequence to enjoy. Ganon's Tower is one of those final sequences that was so thrilling when I first played it, I had to do it over and over again. When I was 13 and 14, my favorite thing was popping in the gold OOT in my N64 with the atomic purple controller in hand and just effortlessly gliding through the last 15 to 20 minutes of Ocarina. That from the staircase at the bottom of the tower to the ending credits still floors me. The 3DS version with its subtle textural enhancements looks phenomenal. It's just an impressive looking game. To this day, the 3DS version is just a solid ass port. We'll get to Majora's Mask in a separate retrospective, but know that the Ganon's Tower is the Nintendo's philosophy taken to its limit. Have the player face off with the ultimate evil baddie in the game by first making them reface every previous challenge and obstacle on a shortened microcosm of the entire game before narrowly scraping by to arrive at the final duel. Miyamoto-san has taken his complete game, Ocarina of Time, miniaturized it once more, and created one hell of an ending. Nintendo's games never just end, and the fight with Ganon is no different. We face off with the same enemy model that was Phantom Ganon, only this time it's really him, and we play another game of energy tennis with falling floor tiles as the twist. I often get knocked down to the bottom of the pit during this fight and have to re-climb the platform, which adds insult to injury. This time was pretty smooth, but I think knowing people were going to watch my gameplay helped. We finally deliver enough blows and Ganon throws up blood or green stuff in this version. The piano ballroom you just fought in disintegrates. Zelda's released from her glass prison and the two of you begin a final escape sequence, which is indeed the coolest part of the game. Link looks badass with his complete loadout equipped. This part of the game isn't difficult per se, as OOT has already challenged you enough at this point, and Zelda and Link's escape sequence along with the final Ganon fight, it's actually pretty easy, but I think with the intended audience in mind, that was the point. Ganon is relatively predictable, and so a well-timed ground roll can put you on his backside in time to hit his tail. I simply avoid Z-targeting, as that only caused me to miss with the hammer at first. It's funny that Nintendo loves to represent pure evil with reptilians, so both Bowser and Ganon have some kind of giant tail in their final form, and I just think that's kind of cool. The tone remains serious, and yet it never gets too dark or scary. Just like any movie, the ending to Ocarina of Time is a worthy send-off to your adventure. Like I mentioned earlier, this part of the game will equip Link with the Master Sword regardless of whether you have the biggoron sword equipped. Zelda's finally able to hold Ganon off and allows Link to grab the legendary blade and deliver its killing blow. The game ends, the credits roll, and Koji Kondo's arrangement plays softly in the background. When I started writing this script, I initially thought about and took inspiration from all the amazing retrospectives that keep coming out about this game. At one point I thought I had missed the boat. I thought nobody cares what I have to say about OOT, and that's still probably true, but I won't let it stop me. I wanted to make this video because I too have something to say about the game, and I think retrospective essays have actually caused me to fall in love with many different games all over again. What is it about Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 that cause fans to go to the lengths we do, to express our deepest love toward these little pieces of interactive media? Ocarina of Time is a shining example of Nintendo's ability to come through in the clutch and simply deliver. These games touch us deeply. It's funny how some electronic toys and children's media from Japan can be so important to so many people. I've no doubt I would have found some other medium to latch onto as a kid in a different life, but I'm sure glad I ended up with video games and here with all of you. That said, yes, of course, Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece. I say to whoever carries the torch, keep inspiring kids and keep believing in them the way Nintendo did. Until next time, Oklasoft out.